Hi, I'm Brian Harvey. Jens suggested that I should give a talk in honor of the Carl V. Karlstrom Outstanding Educator Award given recently to Dan Garcia and me by the Association for Computing Machinery for our work on the beauty and joy of computing curriculum. Here's the ACM blurb about the award. Dan and Brian, blah, 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 bring the beauty and joy of computing to all students, especially those from historically underrepresented communities. Together, Garcia and Harvey have been instrumental, blah, blah, blah. Things you don't see every day. Me in a dinner jacket. And if you zoom in, you can see me holding the award upside down. Don't tell anyone, but it's really Dan's award much more than mine. Not only because he's the ACM education activist, but because, truth be told, I don't care that much about diversity, equity, or inclusion. Side comment. I don't mean that I'm against those things. I'm not Trump. But what I care about is teaching the best computer science course that I can. And I sort of trust that if I can do that, that will attract everybody, include diverse people. Now, what the best means for beauty and joy of computing is mostly functional programming, recursion, and higher order functions. These are ideas that are important to us because they feature in the actual best computer science course ever, which is called Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs, a textbook written by Hal Abelson and Gerald J. Sussman with Julie Sussman. Before BJC, Matt Wright and I wrote the course that it replaced at Berkeley, Simply Scheme. We designed it as a prequel to Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. So it's really Dan's award much more than mine, but I'm up here rather than Dan because this is a SNAP conference. This is going to sound like a digression, but it isn't. All through elementary school, I thought I hated math because, like a lot of kids, I hated arithmetic. Still do. But the first day of algebra, I was so excited. It made sense. The things in algebra are true or false for reasons, not just because the book says so. The whole first week, I was the kid in the front row with my hand up in the air. And then over the weekend, I finished the book. So comes Monday, I'm bored in algebra class because I learned it already. Mr. Wells noticed and asked me what the problem was. I said, I finished the book. So he gave me an impromptu final exam orally on the spot, and then handed me an Algebra 2 book and said, here, don't come to class until you're finished this, then come bring it back and I'll give you another one. I learned so much math that year. I went through half a dozen serious math books. Not just go through the high school curriculum, but things like set theory and number theory and so on. And therefore, I claim, the best teacher I ever had didn't actually teach me anything. And my approach to teaching all my life had its start in that experience. That doesn't mean I think teachers should never teach or that every kid should have exactly the experience that I had in that class. But what it does mean is that every kid is different and every kid has different needs, and a good teacher will notice what this particular kid needs and give the kid that, rather than stand in front of the room saying the same thing to 30 kids at once. My introduction to computers in education came through Logo. The problem that Logo was designed to solve was that kids notoriously hate math, mostly because it was taught as something to memorize rather than as something to understand. So Papert came up with this slogan about teaching children to be mathematicians versus teaching about math. And the way you get kids interested in math is you have them be mathematicians. You have them invent mathematical ideas by experiment. That's the great thing about computers, is that it's a medium in which you can do experiments in math. One of the Logo group's insights was that math isn't just arithmetic. Even before turtle geometry, there was English, which forms words and sentences through a more or less rule-based grammar. And the rules are discoverable by writing sentence generation programs to experiment with them. Logo practitioners had to become progressive educators, even though that wasn't the original goal. When you have small groups of kids all doing different things, you can't just stand in front of the room and talk. So autonomy for kids became a goal along the way to mathematics. And this is why Papert later came to talk about Logo as a Trojan horse, sneaking progressive methods into the school. Logo people still argue about whether it should be seen as a tool to make schooling better or as a harbinger of the elimination of schools altogether. Papert himself was of two minds about this. He wrote several books about Logo and went back and forth. Sorry, here I am up at the top of the screen because this slide is formatted wrongly. I'll put this slide up again at the end, so don't read it now. Growing Up Absurd by Paul Goodman is probably the best book ever written about progressive education. Even though he wrote it in 1956, before the progressive education movement really flowered in the United States. And education wasn't even the main point of the book. I was tempted to fill 5 slides with further quotation from the book, but the most important thing for our purposes is this list of things that progressive schools all believed in to greater or lesser degrees. To learn theory by experiment and doing. To learn belonging by participation and self-rule. We'll come back to self-rule later. Permissiveness in all animal behavior and interpersonal expression. That means sex. I'm pretty sure what he means. And so on. Logo was designed mainly around learning theory by experimenting and doing. But when you have a classroom full of experimenting and creating kids, the good teachers ended up at the community of youth and adults minimizing authority. By the 1980s, when Logo on personal computers became widely available, there were more than a few free schools with no required curriculum at all. Some Logo teachers were really excited by that idea, like me. Others were not. They remembered the origin of Logo in trying to teach kids math, and they wanted to teach kids math. Originally, the goal was to provide a doorway into mathematics for math-hating kids. And so there was curriculum. The old standbys of square, triangle, house, and so on. I'm a revolutionary. Honestly, I think that, at least in the US, the education of the average kid would be improved if we just blew up the schools and let the kids wander around town on their own. Sadly, the kids who would benefit most from blowing up the schools are the same kids for whom even school is a reprieve from their chaotic home environments, so we can't. The point I'm making about Logo is that even though it championed progressive classroom techniques, it wasn't ever meant as an attack on the institution of school, even though many teachers viewed it that way. The goal was to improve school, but not to question the body of knowledge all kids need, the curriculum. Is there such a thing as the body of knowledge all kids need? Especially now, when everyone has a calculator ready to hand, i.e. a smartphone. I still want to attract kids to math, but I'm not convinced we have to compel them to learn it. Jens wants me to predict the future for you. I think AI may be profoundly world-changing for adults who need jobs. But I don't know how much it'll change the lives of children. Mostly, people see AI as a threat. Kids will cheat, or AI will replace teachers, or we just don't know what skills kids will need in an AI-dominated world. I'm pretty confident that AI won't replace teachers for rich kids, and computers have long since replaced teachers for poor kids, long before AI. Why do we still make kids learn arithmetic? People I respect, such as Paul Goldenberg, argue that mathematical understanding has to start with the concrete before the abstract becomes understandable. Therefore, kids won't learn algebra unless they're comfortable with arithmetic. Paul's career has been largely about making arithmetic not be the huge turnoff that it is for most kids. Still, to me, this feels a bit like the ancient Greeks who argued that kids had to learn to memorize poetry even after they invented the smartphone. I feel the same way about teaching to use AI, which is the other thing that people talk about. Once upon a time, everyone said kids had to learn to use a word processor instead of learning to program, lest they be unemployable. What happened wasn't exactly that those people were proved wrong, but rather that kids now grow up in a world in which word processing is no big deal. They take it for granted. Similarly, I think that if it turns out kids have to know how to use AI software, then a generation from now they will know. I don't think that's something I want to worry about. Computer science, the thing that I want to teach, is about, algorithms and stuff. And yes, that includes large language model algorithms for doing AI. And also computer science is about unleashing kids' creativity. Curriculum. This is probably the central contradiction of my life. Dan and I got the Karlstrom Award for the beauty and joy of computing, which is not just any curriculum, but one that's attached to a College Board advanced placement exam, AP Computer Science Principles. In fact, I've spent most of my working lifetime writing curriculum. Computer Science Logo Style, Simply Scheme, and now BJC. Even the SNAP reference manual is full of tutorial curriculum about the more abstract features of the language, starting with first-class lists, then first-class functions, object-oriented programming and inheritance, first-class continuations, and metaprogramming. programming. So that's a curriculum too. But curriculum makes people act like they're in school. Many of the teachers who use BJC press us to add more assessment. And they get upset if kids find solutions to the exercises online. As we speak, people at EDC are sprinkling multiple choice self-test questions into the curriculum pages. I hate that. This is actually one of the better self-check questions because it expects the student to analyze the code rather than just memorize a specific technique. Still, the overall point of this lab is generating sentences from a simple grammar, not programming with random numbers. The self-check questions tend to focus in on things that aren't really the point. Most of the self-check questions are much worse than this one. Also, self-check is a lie. They're adding a zillion of these to BJC because teachers are demanding something in each lab that they can grade. When I say lie, when we first put a few self-check questions in, they really were self-check questions. Most of the lab pages didn't have them. They just appeared where we felt one was necessary. And there weren't enough of them for teachers to use them as a grading instrument. But now every page has self-check questions because that's what teachers want. I have a thing about lies in curriculum. My least favorite is sentences that start with let's. Like, let's open this such and such file, by which they mean, let's you do this. There's no us between the curriculum writer and the kid who are doing something together. So we shouldn't say let's. So all this adds up to saying that I have mixed feelings about even my own curriculum work. What I'm really proud of is the Computer Center Users Society at Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School. In the front row here, you can see me on the right, Paul Goldenberg on the left, and behind us are my friends Deepy and Dan and John and Dominic and Will and Jonathan and Prabhu and Robert and Michael and Kenny and Jay. And the point is, I'm not going to go on to say everybody's name, but the point is that I didn't have to look these up. I know these kids' names, even though this was in the 1982, this picture was. These are my friends, the members of the Computer Center User Society. When I decided to stop reading about teaching and actually do it, it took a while for me to find a school where I felt I'd be able to be me rather than be a teacher. But eventually, through mutual friends, namely Paul and Cindy, I did. And lo and behold, they wanted a computer teacher, which was perfect. I had figured that I would be a math teacher because that's what schools mostly needed that I could do. The Lincoln Sudbury Regional High School is in Sudbury, Massachusetts. It's about a half an hour non-rush hour drive from MIT. I arrived in January 1979 to set up a computer department. The first order of business was to replace their old tiny PDP-8 computer by hustling a big grant from the nearby Digital Equipment Corporation to get a bigger PDP-1170, which is a mini computer, think, refrigerator sized, maybe two refrigerators next to each other. But more important than that, meanwhile, I talked the school into letting me not give grades. I would never get away with that today. But in those days, computers hadn't yet taken over the world. So the school thought of computing as a fun elective, comparable to drama or art, rather than as a core curriculum subject. So I wanted kids to be able to explore turtle graphics, and I also wanted kids to be able to explore words and sentences and using the computer to do word processing and all those things. And that means I needed two different kinds of computer terminals. A real professional graphics terminal in those days cost $10,000. So I wasn't going to get any of those. What I got instead was a grant from Atari of some Atari 800 personal computers, which I programmed to work as Turtle graphics terminals. But the Ataris were designed to display on your, in those days, low bandwidth home TV. So they could only handle 40 columns of text, which was not enough to do, to write your English paper. So I also needed real text terminals. So in my Intro to Computers course, I just couldn't have every kid doing the same thing at the same time. Different kids had to be on different kinds of terminals at different times. So I wrote a bunch of worksheets on various topics, and kids would rotate through the different kinds of terminals and would pull out the worksheet for whatever kind of terminal they were in front of. So I wasn't even tempted to stand in front of the room telling them things. The worksheets, by the way, formed the basis for what became computer science logo style much later. Now everything was great. We had the computer. I didn't have to give grades. We just had two problems. One of them is litter. I always think it's funny that around the same time people started talking about the paperless office, because computers on every desk meant that people wouldn't ever print anything out on paper anymore. They'd just ship files around. And as we all know, that isn't how it works. We generated huge quantities of paper, and it mostly ended up on the floor, to the point where the school's janitors refused to clean up the room. That was problem number one. Problem number two was I would show up at school at 7 in the morning. Classes started at 8. And there'd already be a dozen kids lined up outside the computer center waiting for me to let them in. And in the afternoon, when school ended, they wouldn't let me go home because they still wanted to use the computer. So I kind of had to live at school. My colleague Larry Davidson had the brilliant idea to use these two problems to solve each other. We established the Computer Center Users Society, which would be in charge of running the room, Summerhill style, but specifically including keeping the room clean. I was hoping they'd do it by just teaching themselves to throw garbage in the garbage cans, but no, they set up a rotating schedule with a different kid every day tasked with end-of-day cleanup. And what people got for being a member of the society was a key to the computer center. Another thing I'd never get away with today. One more thing I'd never get away with today is taking kids out to dinner. This started back when we had the old PDP-8, and one of the kids, Peter Blazer, had the idea that he could solve a long-standing system problem, which was that the operating system only allowed privileged users to use the tape drives. So kids couldn't take their files away with them at night or whatever. Peter thought he could fix this, and I said, okay. And in order for him to experiment, what we had to do was every evening shut down the computer. Back then, we did not have kids insisting that I stay there all night because it wasn't that much fun of a computer. So we could shut it down for users and install a separate copy of the system that Peter could hack on. And it took about a month of evenings for him to finish successfully completing his project, which was great. But meanwhile, here I am in the computer center watching Peter work, and it gets to be 7 or 8 o'clock at night, and he's still working. And so I had to feed him, and also feed myself, by the way. So without even thinking about it, I started taking Peter to dinner. Then later on, as we developed a bigger and bigger community of kids who were hanging out after school in the computer center, every so often I would just say, hey, let's go out for Chinese food. We'd all pile into cars and drive into Cambridge, where the Chinese restaurants were. I could never do that today. Never, ever. Another thing that I certainly could never do today is take selected kids home with me for the weekend. No, we did not sleep in the same bed. I'm not Michael Jackson. But, you know, they slept on my fold-out couch in the living room. And, you know, I would feed them. I remember teaching Jonathan and Robert to eat Eggs Benedict, for example, for breakfast. And 2 summers, it was my habit when I was working in Massachusetts to spend the summer in California. And 2 summers I took kids out to California with me. The first time it was just Peter. The second time it was Jonathan and Robert and Jay. And boy, this is certainly something I'd never get away with today. Indeed, after the award ceremony, the ACM, the people who give out the award, they have a People of ACM column in their magazine. And they interviewed me by email. They sent me a bunch of questions which I answered. And I wrote up the Lincoln Sudbury story for them, much as you see it here. But they edited out this part. I hate the 21st century.